You know what's the worst thing that can happen to any photographer while they are shooting? It's when they stop seeing. Of course, I don't mean that they go blind while they're shooting. Well, that would be devastating. But in the context of creating the best photographs that we can out of that particular situation, it would really be bad if we forget to see everything in the photo and ultimately just forget everything about artistic intent and everything about composition and everything about the entirety of the photograph because we forgot to keep looking. We forgot to keep seeing. So in this video, let me share with you 4 things that you should avoid fixating on when you are shooting so that you can continue seeing your photographs. So the first thing, and believe me, this is going to sound weird, but the first thing that you shouldn't fixate on when you are shooting is your subject. Wait, what? Yes, don't fixate on your subject. Of course, your subject is the main bulk of what's in the photograph. The subject is what delivers the message that you are trying to portray. The subject is the star of your photograph. And obviously, that cannot be replaced by anything else, unless, of course, you have something very distracting in the background, which is my point exactly. When you are shooting and you have a subject that somehow makes you feel good, when you have a subject that excites you, whether this be a person, a great landscape, an object, if you're photographing that, there is that tendency that you focus too much on the subject, that you tend to forget everything else that's also in the frame. And of course, the things that you might overlook are what? Maybe other things in the background, distracting things in the background. You might be photographing an A-list celebrity and there's another A-list celebrity in the background, and ultimately that other A-list celebrity will be distracting to the photograph. You get what I'm saying? Other than that, and of course, in addition, are also the minor details that might be in the background. Those things can often be as heavy in terms of visual weight that they pull in so much attention to themselves and ultimately just take away the spotlight from your subject. And even though I am saying that you shouldn't fixate on the subject, this is still, of course, for the good of your subject, for the good of that emphasis, for the good of that unity in your composition. So pay attention to anything that's bright, anything that's colorful in the background, and try to determine if it's actually complementing your subject or it's drawing too much attention away from your subject and towards itself. Of course, other factors are what? Lighting. Lighting is something that you should always pay attention to. Even if perhaps your subject is the most beautiful woman or the most handsome man on earth, even if your subject is the nicest landscape, a big jewel or whatever, pay attention to lighting because lighting can make or break the photograph. Photography is about light, and as cliche as it sounds, bad lighting will, of course, ruin your photograph, no matter how spectacular your photo is. I've seen so many photographers who got so excited with shooting. Well, this is mainly for portraits. They got so excited being able to shoot perhaps a celebrity, and then they forgot to pay attention to the light. So don't fixate on your subject so much so that you forget to look at the entire photograph, that you forget to look at the entire frame, because there might be something that is ruining your composition. And of course, composition is everything. Now, the second aspect that you should, of course, pay attention to is the background. The background is, of course, the canvas right behind your subject. And no matter if you're shooting inside a studio or you're shooting outside with a very nice landscape, that background is one layer that creates the largest element in your frame. If you're shooting a person, if you're shooting an animal or whatever, the background will be its own entity. And of course, as I already said, anything in the background that might be too distracting will take away attention from your subject. It will take away attention from the entire photograph and basically just cause a distraction. Your background, no matter how simple, no matter how spectacular, there will always be a way for it to complement your subject instead of being its own entity that somehow works independently than the subject or any other visual element in your frame. So always look for that right angle, always look for that right lighting, always pay attention to everything that's in the background, even if you're blurring it out, because that will always affect your composition. Now, the third thing that you should always pay attention to but do not fixate on are colors. And of course, if you are not new to this channel, I always say that that photographers should always pay attention to colors because colors can make or break the photograph as well. That stands, that will never change. You should pay attention to colors, especially you should pay attention to how colors affect each other in the frame because that will ultimately dictate the harmony of everything inside your photograph, the harmony of all the visual elements inside your photograph. If you came to work today or you went out today and you chose the clothes that you're wearing depending on which colors match, then ultimately apply the same thing, apply the same principle to your photographs. Color will always be important, but don't fixate on very colorful things. Because again, in the same way that when we are excited about subjects, when we are excited about perhaps models, we can also get really excited when there are really colorful things inside the frame of our photographs. This could either be that you're photographing a nice place with a lot of neon lights, or ultimately you're photographing something that's already very colorful. Don't fixate on that in such a way that you will forget every other aspect of the photo. It's not just because there's very nice neon lighting when you're photographing a model that you will forget how to pose the model or you will forget composition in general. Color is going to be very impactful. Even if the colors are harmonious, of course, it's going to be even more impactful. But if it makes impact and it attracts the eyes of your viewers, but then you forget to follow through with everything else, which is composition and proper exposure and posing and lighting and all of that. Yes, it's going to pull attention, it's going to draw attention for a bit, but then it will be quite disappointing to look at if the viewer sees that you got way too fixated on the colorful aspect. Color is a very powerful and a very heavy aspect of a photograph. So you should always pay attention to it, but never ever fixate so much on it that you forget everything else. Now, the fourth and final thing that I would like to reiterate that we shouldn't fixate on when we are shooting are camera settings. When I was a beginner, I tend to fixate on these things because I tend to be really technical when shooting. I learned photography by myself. I learned and explored the exposure triangle just playing around with it. Then later on watching tutorials and mostly reading books. So I got a little too technical with the way that I did my shoots. And at first, when we start learning photography, when we start learning the technical things about photography, the exposure triangle, for example, of course, the goal is to come up with a balanced exposure, with a good exposure, with a clear image, with good lighting, and yada, 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 right? And of course, that is the goal. But what everyone needs to remember is that we're doing that not just to be able to have balanced exposures. We're doing that not just to be able to come up with good looking numbers or maybe a good looking histogram. We're doing that so that we can move past it and use it later on as a fundamental to creating great photographs. And of course, this is where everything else comes in. We must always remember that exposure is actually even a part of composition. Exposure is part of visual design. How bright or how dark your image is, how bright, how detailed your image is, will affect composition, which makes it still part of composition, which ultimately just encapsulates everything that makes a photo look good. While, yes, it's very important to know how to control your camera, how to control your settings, how to achieve good settings, clear photos without motion blur or with motion blur if you want it, how to blur the background, how not to blur the background, and how to avoid noisy images. Well, yes, that is really good. But remember that that is just part of what we are doing, which is creating good photographs. What I'm saying is it's more important to actually be able to take the photo with proper composition than to fixate on every single digit of all your settings. The reason why we tell beginners to always master the controls of the camera and always master exposure is not because it's the most important thing, but instead it is something that we need to move on to more important things. And that is composition and visual design and lighting and everything else. I've seen a lot of photographers fixate on being able to blur the background of their subject when taking a nice portrait. And yes, of course, sometimes that works. For some people, that works, but it is not everything in the photo. Remember, sometimes you don't even really need to blur the background because the background might be complementing your exposure and your subject and everything else. In the same way, when I was starting out as a landscape photographer, I would find joy in being able to achieve a good balanced exposure with ND filters even if there was no point in doing long exposures anyway. I would be happy that my exposure is good, but ultimately I wasted a minute or 2 minutes of my time because I used unnecessary filters because I wanted to do unnecessarily long exposures because I was fixated on the settings. I was fixated on the exposure settings. And ultimately, that's not bad if you're practicing, but then again, sometimes that will cause you to miss some moments. It will cause you to miss some shots. In my case, the sun has already set and I was still trying to figure out my exposure. I was fixated on settings that I ultimately failed on capturing the photograph that I sought out to capture. There we go. I'm pretty sure you have more to add to this list if you are an experienced photographer or even a beginner who has had some experiences. You are definitely free to share them down below in the comment section. And of course, if you're new to the channel, my name is Nicco Valenzuela. I am a landscape and architectural photographer, and this channel has content about landscape photography, architectural photography, a lot of tech, and a lot of gear. So if you are into any of that, then click that subscribe button and hit that notification bell. But in any case, thank you for watching.